All right, so today we're diving into a question that's captivated thinkers for like centuries,
Yeah.
you know?
Oh, yeah.
Did Jesus Christ actually walk the earth? It's
Mhm.
one that's, obviously at the heart of Christianity,
Right.
but it's also like a fascinating historical puzzle,
Well, for sure.
even if you're not religious at all. And you guys have sent us a ton of material on this, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Articles, research, even like your own notes.
It looks like you've even got some excerpts from The Case Against Christ,
Oh, cool.
which really lays out the arguments for those who believe Jesus is like a myth.
Okay.
It's important to hear both sides of this debate,
Yeah, for sure.
So we'll definitely be exploring those counter-arguments from historians and scholars as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're talking about virgin births, Roman emperors,
Wow.
maybe even like a little detective work on ancient texts. So are you ready to get started?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's start with like the central argument that's presented in the case against Christ. The lack of like firsthand accounts of Jesus from his supposed lifetime.
Right, like no selfies
The exact.
or tweets from first century Judea.
Right, so what evidence do mythicists use to support that argument?
Well, one of their main points is that the Gospels, which are our primary sources for Jesus' life, they were written decades
Oh, wow.
after the events they describe.
Oh, so there's like a gap there.
Right, the time gap raises concerns for some people about the accuracy and reliability of these accounts.
It's almost like playing a game of telephone, right? Like
Yeah.
things can change as stories get passed down, but like, is that enough to just dismiss the Gospels entirely?
Well, that's mythicists also point to these like striking parallels
Okay.
between the Jesus story and myths about other ancient figures,
Okay.
like Horus in Egyptian mythology.
Okay.
Horus had a miraculous birth, he performed miracles, and even had a resurrection story.
So are these similarities just purely coincidental, or could there be like a deeper connection?
Right.
Why do these themes appear in multiple cultures and stuff?
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Some argue that these shared themes suggest that Jesus might be more of like an archetype,
Okay.
a recurring figure that embodies universal human aspirations.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that similar stories can arise independently or through like cultural exchange,
Right.
without negating the existence of any one figure.
So just because there are multiple superhero stories with similar themes
Right.
doesn't mean Superman and Batman can't both exist.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's put our detective hats back on.
Okay.
What other clues are the mythicists examining?
Well, they highlight the silence of certain historical figures who lived around the time of Jesus.
Okay.
For example, Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher living in Judea, he doesn't mention Jesus in any of his extensive writings.
Now that's interesting to clarify for our listener. Philo was like a prominent intellectual figure of the time,
Oh, yeah.
and his lack of mention is a point mythicists often raise.
Right.
What about like other historians?
Well, there are mentions of Jesus in the works of Roman historians Tacitus and Josephus,
Okay.
but these are highly debated among scholars.
Okay.
Some believe these passages might be forgeries or later additions by Christian scribes.
So we're talking potential fake news in ancient Rome.
Right.
This is where historical analysis gets tricky.
Yes.
It's like piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces
Yeah.
and potential forgeries. But isn't it possible that Jesus just like wasn't well known enough during his life to warrant a mention by like every single historian?
That's a really good point. Absence of evidence doesn't automatically equal evidence of absence.
Right.
It's crucial to consider the limitations of historical sources
Yeah.
and the possibility that some information just hasn't survived.
Right. We can't assume that like everything was meticulously documented back then like it is today.
For sure.
So we've heard some pretty compelling points from the case against Christ.
Yeah.
So far, what are some of the counter arguments that support a historical Jesus?
That's where we'll pick up next. There's a wealth of evidence and perspectives to consider.
Ooh, I'm excited. I can't wait.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Okay, so we've heard kind of the skeptic side, like what do historians who believe in a historical Jesus, what do they have to say?
Well, despite all those challenges we just talked about, most historians and biblical scholars, they do say that Jesus existed.
Okay.
They might debate, how divine he was, but the man himself is largely accepted as a real figure from history.
So what evidence like tips the scales for them?
Yeah.
What makes them think that he wasn't just like a myth?
Well, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from the letters of Paul.
Okay.
And those were written pretty early on, like within a few decades of Jesus' death.
So unlike the Gospels, we're talking about texts that were written much closer to the events.
Exactly.
Okay, so what do those letters tell us?
So Paul, who initially persecuted Christians,
Hmm.
right? He had this dramatic conversion experience, and he became a key figure in spreading this new faith. In his letters, he refers to Jesus as a real person, someone he believed lived and died and was resurrected.
Oh, wow.
He even mentions specific details, like referring to James as the brother of the Lord, so suggesting a familial connection.
That's really interesting. Like, these letters offer a glimpse into like the very early days of Christianity.
Right.
From someone who like claimed to have interacted with people who knew Jesus.
Yeah.
But couldn't the mythicists argue that he was just like buying into the myth himself?
They could, but it's important to consider the broader context.
Okay.
When we look at the Gospels, we can't ignore the specific cultural and historical setting of first century Palestine.
So zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Okay, what does that context tell us?
It tells us that the Gospels, even if written later, they reflect a very specific Jewish milieu.
Okay.
The language, the customs, the beliefs that are portrayed, they're all deeply rooted in that time and place. They're not just some random collection of like borrowed pagan myths.
So if Jesus was a figure entirely invented from like other myths, wouldn't the story feel kind of out of sync with that setting?
Yeah, exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
Archaeology actually backs up a lot of the details mentioned in the Gospels.
Wait, so we're talking about like real tangible evidence. Okay,
Yeah.
that supports those accounts. Give me some examples.
Sure. So we have really solid historical evidence for places associated with Pontius Pilate,
Yeah, okay.
the Roman governor who, according to the Gospels, sentenced Jesus to death.
Right.
We also have evidence for the practice of crucifixion being a really common form of execution back then.
So these details in the Gospels aren't just like random fabrications.
Right.
They align with what we know about that period from other historical sources.
Precisely. And here's another thought-provoking point.
Okay.
The rapid spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire is pretty hard to explain without a compelling central figure.
That makes sense. It's hard to imagine like a religion based on a myth gaining so much momentum so quickly, especially in a time without like mass media or anything.
Right, a powerful and inspiring figure, someone like Jesus as he's depicted in the Gospels, is much more likely to have ignited that kind of fervent belief.
So both sides have presented like really strong arguments. It seems like this debate is about more than just examining historical facts. It touches on like faith belief and even like what we consider to be valid evidence.
You're absolutely right. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's explore some of these bigger questions that this debate raises.
Sounds fascinating. Let's unpack those deeper layers. Yeah, it's fascinating to see how this question of like Jesus's existence isn't just about historical facts. You know, it's also about faith and interpretation and what we even consider to be like valid evidence.
Absolutely, and it's totally natural for people to approach this question with some skepticism, especially like in our increasingly secular world.
Oh, for sure.
Critically examining beliefs, whether they're religious or historical, is a healthy part of intellectual growth.
Yeah, totally. It's not about just blindly accepting everything we hear, but this also raises an important point.
Right.
Even if we can't like definitively prove that Jesus walked the earth, does that diminish the power or meaning of his teachings for people who find them meaningful?
That's a great question. Spiritual truths can transcend like historical specifics.
Okay.
For many people, the message of love and compassion and forgiveness that's embodied by the figure of Jesus holds profound meaning,
Right.
regardless of whether or not he was a literal historical figure.
It's kind of like how we can appreciate the beauty and wisdom of a poem without obsessing over whether the poet actually lived every experience they describe.
Exactly.
The message can resonate even if we can't confirm every historical detail.
Right, and it's important to remember, this isn't about winning an argument or anything.
Right.
This is about understanding different perspectives and engaging in respectful dialogue. You know, whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between.
Yeah, I completely agree. We can learn so much from listening to different viewpoints, even if we don't ultimately agree with them.
For sure.
So, having explored both sides of this debate, what stands out to you? What are your key takeaways?
Well, for me, it's this realization that the evidence, both for and against Jesus' existence, It's way more complex and nuanced than, simple headlines might suggest.
Yeah,
This deep dive wasn't about giving you a definitive answer,
right.
but about giving you the information to form your own conclusions.
And I think we've accomplished that. We've laid out the arguments, highlighted the key evidence, and now it's up to you listening to weigh it all and decide what resonates with you. But before we wrap up, I have one final thought that I can't shake up.
Oh, I love those lingering questions. Let's hear it.
Okay, so if the case against Christ raises valid points and there are legitimate questions about the historical evidence, how do we explain the profound impact the story of Jesus has had for over 2,000 years?
Right.
Art, music, literature, entire cultures have been shaped by this figure.
That's a really powerful point, even if we set aside, religious beliefs. The cultural influence is undeniable.
Right.
I mean, think about the masterpieces of art that have been inspired by the Jesus narrative.
Yeah.
The music that's moved millions, the countless acts of charity that have been done in his name.
Exactly. And it's not just confined to one culture or time period either.
Right.
The story of Jesus has resonated across continents, languages, historical eras. It's pretty amazing.
It really makes you think about the enduring power of stories and how they can shape human history, whether or not a figure like Jesus literally walked the earth. The impact of his story is woven into the fabric of our world.
For sure.
That's something worth reflecting on, no matter what you personally believe.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's a whole world of books, articles, documentaries out there waiting to be explored. So keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.
Well said. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into whether Jesus really existed. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope you found it as thought-provoking as we have.
Yeah, me too.
Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those curious minds engaged.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.